Okay, so it's funny because we have these spotlights on us, or, stage lights. So I can't really see who's in the audience, but thank you for coming. What's that? Yes, yeah, there are people there. Good. And is the mic okay? Yes, okay. All right, so I thought I would start, I'm going to be talking about a very new project. I mean, I've started working on it for maybe a year or so, but I'm really still formulating the thoughts about how it's going to come together. So actually, Roundtable is a great way to present a new project like that, and I welcome all kinds of criticism and suggestions. I thought I would start with a popular book that I think many people are reasonably familiar with, which is The Omnivore's Dilemma by Michael Pollan. And the first chapter of that book, he begins by talking about corn. It's obviously a book about food, and the problems of food, particularly in American culture. And his first chapter, not the introduction, but begins by talking about the Maya, who he says call themselves the corn people, or think of themselves as the people of corn. And then he sort of jumps forward to the present and begins to present this sort of startling fact that, in fact, Americans in the US are the corn people, because 25% or so of the products in any supermarket are basically corn-based in one way or another, not to mention other non-food items, packaging, and so on. And there is surprising amounts of corn in things like cattle feed and so on. So he says, if you are what you eat, what we mostly are is corn, we being Americans in the US. So I thought I would start with that partly because the Maya, he invokes the Maya, which are close to JCB interests at the Archive of the Americas and so on, but also because that book, while very popular, has very little history in it. And though he talks about ancient cultures and ancient sort of food practices and sort of long-term scope thinking in terms of the long history of the evolution of foods like corn or plants like corn, he really has very little history in his book, and he focuses on the political and ecological sort of decisions on an individual level about what people eat and how they should be more informed about what's actually in their food so they can make sort of better, more sustainable, and more ethical choices about what they eat. What I want to do in my new project, which I've called tentatively Fodder for Empire, Feeding People Like Other Animals in the long 18th century, is to take the industrial food system sort of as an endpoint or as an inspiration for thinking about food, and particularly food that becomes industrialized, or plants that become integrated and integral to the industrial food system in the late 19th and 20th century from a longer perspective, and particularly from an imperial perspective. Which I don't think there is a lot of good food history out there that does such a thing, that problematizes the politics and maybe the political economy of the modern food system in terms of other periods in which large-scale thinking about producing food in abundant quantities or addressing issues of scarcity, which is sort of what the industrial food system does very well. There are other periods of time in which these problems came to the fore, and that's the kind of question that I'm pursuing in this project. So Fodder for Empire is going to look at the sciences of food and nutrition in Britain and the British Empire in the long 18th century, especially after the 7 Years' War and through the Napoleonic Wars. And it seeks to understand when, why, and how food security first became an object of government planning, of policy, and of scientific interest, a sort of a domain of scientific expertise. I think that, I want to propose in this project that the first time that this really became an object of scrutiny was in the British Empire after the massive expansion of colonial territory, after the British triumph in the 7 Years' War, when you have many dependent populations scattered in far-flung places around the world that need to be provisioned, not to mention the sailors, the soldiers, and the new settlers that are sent to these kinds of places. So provisioning becomes a sort of an explicit object of interest among policymakers and naturalists in this period of ongoing military conflict, especially with France, and also rising rents and food prices, serious harvest shortfalls, and renewed debates about provisioning about regulating the Atlantic provisions trade, especially after the American Revolution, when supplies are cut off from basically from the United States to the British Empire. Where will the British Empire get wheat, for example, or meat? So on the one hand, you have the dramatic expansion of territory, the realignment of colonies who are suppliers to the empire, and you also have, in the second half of the 18th century, the rise of abolitionist thinking, so that the people who are going to be working to produce food, potentially, especially in plantation colonies, are the new object of the interest of a rising welfare state, you could say, not just of abolitionists, but they become swept into the idea that the state has to take care of its subjects writ large. So responding to these imperial crises of land and labor, men associated with the Royal Society, the British Board of Agriculture, the Navy, and other prominent agencies became intrigued with a range of policy proposals for providing cheap, densely caloric food to slaves, prisoners, orphans, laborers of various kinds, and also animals. And I think the most famous example of this is breadfruit, of the scheme to transport breadfruit from the South Seas to the Caribbean plantation colonies. But in fact, there are many other proposals that go along with that one. That's sort of the most sensationalized because of Bligh and the bounty. But wild rice, as I've written about recently, I think can be thought of in the same way as breadfruit for cold climate places, how to provision cold climate colonies in a sort of sustainable way, to use an anachronistic term. And this is the idea for this sort of project actually came out in a sense from sources that I was looking at for my dissertation research, and then for my research for my first book, which is about climate change debates in the British Empire. And I kept seeing this sort of theme scattered in a range of sources, whether they were agricultural improvement manuals or plantation manuals or recipe books, or sort of William Petty's political arithmetic, thinking about land and labor equations. That is, how to feed people in cheaply, reliably, and in a way that kind of takes into account the distances that are covered by the empire. So something that I kind of saw latent in the sources, I wanted to bring out and formulate in terms of a project. So I think the Roundtable is going to be talking about, people are going to be focusing to some extent on sources and methods that they're using to think about environmental history. And so far, to me, the sources that I'm using are fairly conventional, printed sources, advice literature, policy proposals, and so it's just sort of settlement schemes and so on. But I'm interested in thinking about other sources I can use to address this project. So I thought I'd just give you a sense of some of the key examples that I've seized upon that gave me this idea, which essentially are ideas in which proposals for feeding people cheaply coalesce with ideas come out of ideas for providing fodder for livestock, and that's why the second part of the title, Feeding People Like Other Animals in the Long 18th Century, that Arthur Young, Benjamin Rumford, Benjamin Franklin, Joseph Banks, and a whole host of other kind of big names talk explicitly about feeding laborers and other sort of working people in the same way that farmers provide fodder for livestock. So, for example, Benjamin Franklin has instructions for using cornmeal as a substitute for wheat in bread, porridge, dessert recipes. as a substitute for wheat or rice, quote, so as to afford a wholesome and pleasing nourishment to men and other animals. Or Arthur Young hoped to convince British husbandmen to repurpose surpluses of Jamaican sugar as cattle fodder, as a supplement in cattle fodder. And Benjamin Rumford, in a whole series of recipes in an essay called Of Food, and particularly of Feeding the Poor, where he has general directions for preparing a cheap soup and a receipt for a very cheap soup, in which he explains, quote, the importance of culinary processes for preparing food shown from the known utility of a practice common in some parts of Germany of cooking for cattle. So the kind of the idea that these could be equivalent is fairly wide-ranging, right? And since my time is basically up, and we're giving very quick presentations, I just wanted to point out that in books like Omnivore's Dilemma or Fast Food Nation and other sorts of critiques of the industrial food system, the idea that people are eating, that humans are made of corn, or eating things that like cattle feed, essentially the same as cattle feed, or that cows are fed corn, which is not, naturally what they eat, which is grass, of course. This is a moment of horror and shock. And in a sense, from this longer perspective, it's not surprising at all that we've developed a system that is based on a kind of using plants that are easy to plant over large distances, that of course over large expanses in huge quantity, easy to process, and then distribute over long distances that keep, essentially, that this is a kind of hardly a surprising fact. So the last thing I just wanted to mention before I move on is how is this environmental history? So the way I'm thinking about it as environmental history is in a number of ways. I think it, as Craig Muldrew and Tony Wrigley and other economic historians have recently turned to food history in terms of thinking about energy history, and what Wrigley calls the food was the fuel, the petrol of the early modern economy. So I think it connects with energy history, it clearly connects with agricultural history, and the ways in which soil is a part of food systems and the economy of empire. And finally, I would say in a period when at least some people, maybe we could say many people, are getting on the bandwagon of thinking about the current era as the Anthropocene, that many aspects of the past, I think that earlier wouldn't have been considered as environmental history by the kind of, in the first few decades of the field, that was really focused and continues to be to a large extent on conservation history and environmental politics in the 20th, 19th, and 20th centuries. Now I think a whole range of topics are going, it's easier to explain how something like food history, for example, or maps, or disease, or other kinds of topics very clearly become part of an analysis that requires you to think about the ecological framework of what otherwise might be thought of as military or political or imperial history. So, looking forward to hearing other comments, and sorry for going on a bit longer than I planned.
Thank you, Anya. Heidi, would you like to come up?
Sure. So I have to apologize for using my laptop to read this morning. I didn't get a chance to print out my paper, so I'm trying to balance my own laptop on top of the other one, but it should work. So I want to talk today a little bit about a current book project that I'm working on in order to address some of the central themes of this panel on environmental history. And I just want to pick up, I suppose, very briefly on some of Anya's final comments, because I guess I'd never, until relatively recently, considered myself in a formal way an environmental historian. So I think perhaps many of us are rethinking our relationship with environmental history, and perhaps actually many of us have been doing environmental history in particular ways without even, I suppose, being aware of it or identifying ourselves as such. So I want to talk a little bit about some ideas that come out of a chapter on a book project entitled Mining Places and Subterranean Spaces, Nature, Government, and Moral Debate in the Exploitation of the Underground. So I'm currently working on mining and ideas about the subterranean, about the underground in colonial Latin America, in particular on the Andean regions. And I'm interested in a range of questions, but I suppose in particular the way in which space and place played a role in shaping the ideas and discourses surrounding mining, its justifiability, the way in which it should be carried out, and thinking perhaps in particular about the imaginative construction of mining in the context of, for example, colonial frontiers, and thinking broadly about how ideas about mining connected to wider understandings of nature and environment. So the brief, I suppose, little vignette that I want to present this morning comes from a chapter that looks at what I describe as the subterranean dimensions of 18th century debates over American nature. So I think that when we bring mining into conversation with environmental history, it's perhaps natural to think first and foremost of the damage that the extraction of precious metals has caused over the centuries on soil, on water, on air, and consequently, of course, on human health. And an excellent example of that kind of study, a very important one, is Nicholas Robbins' book, Mercury, Mining, and Empire. Now, my own attempts to connect environmental history and mining take a different approach in the sense that I'm interested primarily in how mining-related discourses in the Andes were connected to ideas and arguments about the physical environment, not just about subterranean space and its characteristics, but more generally about environments and climates in the Andes. So I'm interested in showing that colonial ideas about the natural world were enmeshed in significant and perhaps also surprising ways with discussions that emerged in relation to the mining industry in the 18th century. So I want to first turn to outlining a brief example and then go on to make a few brief comments about its possible significance. In the Andean world, as was the case in other parts of Spanish America, the second half of the 18th century brought widespread reforms to revitalize the flagging mining economy, but also growing interest where Crown and colonial policy were concerned in encouraging the development of agriculture and the exploitation of a whole range of natural resources beyond precious metals. Debates over economic policy and practice were very often framed by discussions over the qualities of climate, of soil, and geography, and so forth. And one particular notable example of this kind of forum is the patriotic Peruvian journal, Mercurio Peruano, published between 1790 and 1795. Now, one Lima-based intellectual and prominent contributor to this journal, José Javier Baquijano y Carrillo, was an individual who championed the cause of mining, arguing that the qualities of land and climate were so hostile to agriculture that mineral extraction was really the only viable option. He claimed that in Peru, most lands, to quote, reject active attempts at agricultural production due to the very nature of the land, climate, and location. Either they are immense wildernesses, arid and dry, without any irrigation or relief, apart from the scant moisture that they receive from the sky, or they consist of frozen rocks that render cultivation impossible. By contrast, he said, nature had compensated Peru's lamentable condition with an abundance of precious metals. And its harsh and arid mountains, he said, were a perpetual laboratory of gold and silver. And so for this very reason, Peruvians, he said, must search for wealth in the interior and not on the surface of their lands. But at the same time, we see also in the Mercurio Peruano proponents of agricultural development and of the exploitation of what we might call green wealth, depicting Peru as a kind of natural cornucopia characterized precisely by its immense fertility and abundance in an agricultural or botanical sense. Now, probably we should not be too surprised to find economic arguments being framed by environmental discourses in a journal that was aimed largely at disseminating knowledge about Peru's territories and geography, and that received contributions from intellectuals with an explicit interest in natural history and in science. But we can also find comparable environmental framings in discussions over mining that were, at least on the surface, very far removed from the pursuit of natural history. In 1795, so in the same time, same time frame, we find the magistrate of the audience of Charcas, Victorian de Villava, and Charcas roughly corresponds to modern-day Bolivia, presenting a lengthy manuscript treatise passionately denouncing the mining mita, the system of draft labor used in the Potosi mines, arguing that it was a form of temporary slavery. And he declared in his opening paragraph that we should care more about the lives of mortals than about acquiring more metals. And he was deeply skeptical about the benefits that mining could bring. And he imagined Peru as a kind of human body and described mining as an illness that interferes with the circulation of the humors through all of its limbs. Now, these arguments made by Villava were vigorously contested by Francisco de Paula Sanz, the current intendant of Potosi, and he denounced both Villava's denunciation of the mita and also of his rejection of mining as a viable industry. And Paula Sanz drew on environmental discourses also to reject Villava's arguments in a lengthy written response. From his perspective, the need to focus above all on exploiting the subsurface was patently obvious given the natural constitution of the territory. What single district in Peru, he asked rhetorically, possessed lands that were sufficiently fertile to actually allow the indigenous peoples to work them as effortlessly as Villava had claimed? Not one, he said, so not one district in the whole of Peru was capable of sustaining its resident Indians through agriculture alone, something that Villava had argued for. But this, he said, was entirely natural because, and I quote here, where metals are found in abundance, fertile lands are necessarily scarce. The lands in those areas are all arid and lacking, even in the tiniest bush, and there is no sight more melancholy than that of mountains and plains that are rich in mines. So we can see the intendant vigorously deployed the idea of an impoverished subterranean natural world to argue that the exploitation of the underground had to be prioritized above all else. So I just very briefly want to suggest that this example of the enmeshing of environmental discourses with debates over mining point to a couple of interesting issues. And first, we see that environmental discourses can often be found in unexpected places. So what I want to suggest in part is that we look beyond perhaps sources like the Mercurio Peruano to look at, for example, economic debates over mining, to look, let's say, for archival and less obvious sources for finding insights into environmental perceptions. But perhaps a more interesting observation that can be made in light of this example is that ideas about climate and environment often shaped and were embedded in matters of day-to-day administration. So I think there's a need perhaps to explore more thoroughly the environmental dimensions of colonial governmentality and economy, going beyond a focus on cultures of collecting, of scientific expeditions, and intellectual debates over natural history. And if one of the wider objectives of environmental history is to show that we need to integrate environmental dimensions into the questions that we ask about social worlds to better understand human society, then I think widening our horizons beyond areas such as collecting and scientific expeditions is an important agenda. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Heidi. So Mark Molesky is next. Let me make sure that we have this going.
Looks like it lost the image there.
Is the tech person coming to our rescue?
There used to be an image there.
Yeah. Simple. This happens to me when I'm lecturing world history.
Is this the one?
But there used to be an image there
Yeah.
as well. Sure. I don't really even need it. It's just we lost the image. Okay. Thank you.
This one forwards it.
Yeah.
This one brings it
Okay.
back.
There used to be an image here, but I don't know what happened to it in the last 10 minutes. I'd like to thank the panel and conference organizers for inviting me, and at least on some level, thinking that I'm trendy. When I began this project that I've been working on for several years, a history of the Lisbon Earthquake disaster of 1755 and its impact on European culture, not only didn't I realize that I would be doing environmental history, I had little understanding about how important it would be for me to gain a grasp of the science surrounding what I now realize was an exceedingly complex seismic and environmental event. Now, for those of you who aren't acquainted with the Lisbon earthquake, on November 1st, 1755, All Saints' Day, at about 9:30 a.m., a fault line off the southwest coast of Iberia ruptured, causing a massive earthquake between, we estimate, 8.5 and possibly 9.2 on the moment magnitude scale, the largest earthquake to impact Europe in the last 10,000 years. Because it was a megathrust earthquake, it caused a massive tsunami, and there you see the little star in the center is the approximate epicenter. Waves from this tsunami not only hit Portugal, Spain, and Morocco, they went all the way to the British Isles, Newfoundland, the Caribbean, across the equator, and smashed into northeastern Brazil. In Lisbon, there was also a massive fire caused by this that I'll be talking about a little bit later. My initial naive thought was that I would read a few books on earthquakes, tsunamis, and large fires, boil down the important points about each phenomenon, insert a few paragraphs in the appropriate places in the manuscript as background, and that would be that. It was really, I thought, a question of being thorough. I now realize that my scientific understanding, such as it is, of what actually took place on All Saints' Day, 1755, informs much of the book. And not merely those passages which deal explicitly with the physical nature of the disaster. Take, for example, my assessment of eyewitness accounts of the disaster. Not only do I need to have a solid grasp of what my historical actors believe they were experiencing and why, I have to, as best I can, understand what they are experiencing. This context helps to illuminate their accounts in all sorts of ways. And in the end, modern readers demand a scientific explanation for what is occurring. Now, in the case of the Lisbon earthquake, there is a serious discrepancy between what people thought was happening to them and what was actually happening. Now, the reason for this, or the main reason for this, was that in 1755, no one knew what caused earthquakes. In fact, it wasn't until the late 1950s and early 1960s when plate tectonics became accepted by the scientific community that the mystery, so to speak, was solved. So if I may, I'd like to read a short passage from my manuscript to give you a sense of the kind of source analysis that I'm engaged in. At precisely 9:30 a.m. on November 1st, 1755, 325 miles west of Cape St. Vincent, Portugal, a Captain Eliezer Johnson of Boston felt his ship shake very much two different times, though the sky was very clear and the sea very smooth, reported the Boston Gazette. The first shock lasted 2 or 3 minutes. Then about 3 minutes later came on the second, which lasted about 2 minutes and shook Johnson's ship to such a degree that it unhung the card of his compass, then in the binnacle. At around the same time, 120 miles west of the Cape, the crew of the Jean was thrown 18 inches from the deck by a sudden jolt. While 750 miles southwest of Iberia, a tremor shook the Mary to such a manner that it overturned the compass and broke most of the earthenware, china, and bottles on board. It strained the ship as if she had been striking on the ground, recalled the captain, and cracked the seams on the deck, which afterwards leaked, though they had been quite tight before. It's significant, I think, that both the sailors and the editors of the Boston Gazette were confused by what was happening. The unexpected shock or jolt occurred in relatively calm seas with no strong winds. And indeed, many eyewitness accounts from Lisbon contain descriptions of the atmospheric conditions at the time: the temperature, the barometric pressure, wind speed, and direction. And while none of these variables were believed to be the leading cause of earthquakes in the 18th century, underground fires and exploding gases in subterranean caverns were, they did overlap with Aristotle's view that earthquakes were caused by wind flowing through underground caverns. And so, in the absence of any concrete or convincing evidence that explained earthquakes, Aristotle's caverns were joined with more recent research on volcanoes and underground thermal dynamics and phenomenon. Now, what caused the shocks to those ships in the North Atlantic? Well, most likely it was the arrival of the first seismic waves from the earthquake, more specifically P waves or body waves. These are the fastest of the seismic waves, and they would be followed by other waves, S waves, Raleigh waves, and Love waves, and then about a half hour later, the tsunami arrived. Now, one of the consequences of this 18th century theory that underground fires caused earthquakes was that some eyewitnesses were led or compelled to report that they saw fire emanating from holes or openings in the ground. This, of course, not only served to buttress the leading theory on earthquakes, but it helped to explain the cause of the great fire that followed it. And this fire raged for several weeks. It, in fact, gutted the center of the city and caused more material damage in Lisbon than the earthquake and the tsunami combined. Now, I have no doubt that these eyewitnesses did see fires issuing from beneath the rubble, but their origin was not underground caverns, probably overturned candles. It was All Saints' Day after all, and buried stoves that had been just a few moments before cooking the feast day meal. On the whole, however, I think eyewitness accounts have been more helpful to me than not. Many eyewitnesses, in fact, discuss the movements of the earthquake quite accurately. Some describe buildings swaying like ships on the sea. Some describe sort of vertical movements. There was a priest who was giving confession, and he was in the confessional, and he felt the ground sort of pushing up from his. And that's exactly these different waves that I described have different effects on human beings and buildings. And if you learned a little bit about earthquakes, you can sort of identify what exactly they are experiencing. One eyewitness even said that he heard the stones in the walls of his house grinding against each other. Now, I thought this was an exaggeration, a kind of a literary flourish. But on August 23rd, 2011, I was sitting in my apartment in New York City, my chair, writing a book on the earthquake, and I felt the building move. And I had no idea it was an earthquake. I learned that later. But I could hear, because I was at the corner of my apartment, I heard what I thought were bricks grinding against each other. And I talked to a seismologist later, and she said, you probably did experience that. Ultimately, eyewitness accounts of the fire enabled me to make what I believe was an original discovery. In general, survivors of the earthquake were awed by the fire, which followed the earthquake. Many provide graphic and detailed descriptions of it. Intense heat that they could feel hundreds of yards away, a strong and steady wind, showers of ash, and the curious comment that at night, hundreds of meters away, the brightness from the fire was such that people could read from it. And when I began to consult the literature on large fires, I realized that the eyewitness accounts were describing the elements or the ingredients of a firestorm. That is, a fire that under the right conditions becomes so hot that it creates its own wind system. It literally sucks the surrounding oxygen into it, in some cases asphyxiating people who are actually several hundred meters away from the fire. And hence the strong winds that are reported over and over by these eyewitnesses. And if you've ever been to Lisbon, the Baixa, you see it as kind of a bowl shape. There are all these hills. That's a classic topographical place for a firestorm to occur. Yet when I consulted the lists of the Great Firestorm, Lisbon was not on any of them. Presumably because it had been overshadowed by the great earthquake that has always defined this disaster. So my theme is a simple one. When historians are grappling with events like catastrophes, a dialogue between the sort of historical sensibility and science is not only crucial, it very quickly becomes inevitable. Thank you.
Is this the one?
Yeah. Cool. All right.
This one forwards it.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thanks very much, Tatiana, for helping putting this together. And my name is Chris Pastore, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the sources. And recently, I had somebody ask me, a historian asked me, is there like a single repository or something that you, like environmental historians would go to, like a treasure trove or something like that, right? And I said, I was kind of shocked. I was like, no, not at all. But it's a reasonable question. And where do environmental historians get their stuff? And I was just so pleased to see in Neil's email a few weeks back that that environmental history has become a core interest of the John Carter Brown Library. And there is a lot of stuff in the John Carter Brown Library and other regional archives where we can do this environmental stuff, where we can kind of find these sources. And so I'll talk about some of my favorite sources that I found specifically at the John Carter Brown Library, and that shaped. I have a recent book that just came out called Between Land and Sea, the Atlantic Coast and the Transformation of New England. And that book looks at coasts broadly, but it focuses specifically on Narragansett Bay. So I'll actually show you a couple things about Narragansett Bay and how I came to follow these sources in a way that one could conceivably construct a narrative, right? The first source here is a codex that's in the library here. It's a proceedings of the, give it the copy of the record of the proceedings of the Boundary Commission between Rhode Island and Massachusetts in 1741. And it's about colonial boundaries, right? People pay taxes, people fight over boundaries. As I started digging into this source, though, what I realized was they were trying to figure out how they understood this place, where these boundaries might lie. And what they did is they created a map, and the map was a pretty good geographic representation of this space. But they, in creating this map, they also, according to the custom of the time, created a narrative description of this map-making process, what they called from the late 17th century into the early 18th century, geodetic writing, or what we've come to know as geodetic writing. And they created it in verse. It's actually a horrible poem. But the proceedings of this Boundary Commission talk about how people understood space, how they understood it, and how it changed over time, both in terms of the memory of that space, but in terms of what they saw and what was in front of them. This poem, or the map, for instance, kind of shows it geographically, but the poem hints at the extent to which this space was a deeply human and widely variable construct. So I was drawn toward these kind of lyrical descriptions of these places. In general, the sources that get me most excited, I guess, are those sources that give that sense of place, right? That kind of give us a picture of what things might have looked like. But in addition to seeing kind of material space, material change over time, again, I want to understand how people understood those spaces. And I love that kind of relationship between, again, how people thought about a space and how they changed it materially, and how that in turn changed what they thought over time. What I noticed with these sources is they were adding kind of contour to this coastal space. They were adding coherence. They were adding order to it. They were also adding order to the space over the top of the bay. And this is the diary of Samuel Tillinghast, that is also a section of which is at the John Carter Brown Library. And he's focusing mostly on the weather. But I wanted to know how, over this long sweep of time, how during the 18th century, at least, people understood the skies, right? And there's lots of weather diaries, but how, to what extent was Samuel Tillinghast observing the weather in terms of the conventions of London, and this kind of expanding weather watching system that was happening during the 18th century. And what we see over time is, again, this kind of systematic organization of the space over the top of the water. There's also these wonderful pictures as you can see, it's kind of hard to see because of the light, but there's also these wonderful pictures kind of peppered throughout the diary, and it's unclear whether he did them or maybe one of his kids or something like that did them, but they're just fun to look at. Lastly, I'll show you this map. This is the map that we all got as a wonderful gift from the library, but this map kind of had its roots in the middle of the 18th century when Samuel Holland was hired by the Board of Trade to survey the northern sections of continental America. And one of his deputies, this guy Charles Blaskowitz, in 1964 he comes to Narragansett Bay to start, 1764 comes to Narragansett Bay to start surveying it. In this early survey, there's a written report that goes along with it, possibly created by the colonial governor of Grenada, Robert Melville, in which he's describing the bay in great detail, talking about the bay as an excellent man-of-war harbor. He talks about the farmers. He said there's excellent soil with the highest state of cultivation, and that Narragansett Bay was filled with men of science. It had a wonderful library in Newport, and society was, quote, much better informed in general literature than any I have met with in any part of the world, right? So it's a map, all right? But the process of creating the map, how it was understood by those who were in conversation as they were creating it, was incredibly revealing to me. And what we see is through the 1760s and 1770s, tensions rising between colonial Rhode Islanders and British authorities, particularly those revenue cutters that are trying to impose the rules on Rhode Islanders. In 1772, the Gaspé actually, partly because of a lack of knowledge about the bay, runs aground off of Warwick Neck. Rhode Islanders burn it to the waterline, and this perhaps encourages or informs the Board of Trade's decision to have Blaskowitz return for this more detailed map. And in October 1774, he begins the second more comprehensive survey. And December 1775, British troops occupy Newport, and this map, or an early version of this map, is created in 1776. It's a little bit less detailed, but this map is created printed by William Faden in 1777, and it's the most detailed rendering of Narragansett Bay to date. Now, earlier maps done by Rhode Islanders had been created in an attempt to perhaps raise some imperial funds for infrastructure projects. But by 1776, 1777, when they're making these maps, these are attempts at imperial control. And we see kind of the tables turned. And we see a new level of order brought to the bay, brought to this coastal space, a new level of order kind of greater than anything that had been done before. And to me, as an environmental historian, this suggests this kind of perhaps relentless push of progress that's coming into the bay. The American Revolution very much brings that about. And so, again, these are just a handful of sources, and I'm actually steering my new research. I'm trying to wrap my mind around an environmental history of the American Revolution more broadly. And I do think there are a lot of these sources that we have visited for many different types of projects we can revisit again, and that will perhaps inform this more environmentally minded, more geographically sensitive type of history. So thank you very much.
So let's see if I can get my own up. Thank you, everybody. Before I begin, I just wanted to call attention to Christopher's book that he mentioned. It's a beautiful hardcover from Harvard, and it really does explain beautifully what we can do in terms of transforming documents that you might find at the JCB into a wonderful narrative. So today, I want to tell you a little bit about my own project, by beginning with a question. What is the river today? What is the Rio Grande, or the Rio Bravo, that borders Mexico and the United States? The Rio, which flows from south central Colorado in the United States to the Gulf of Mexico for a total length of nearly 1,900 miles. Its course shifts a little bit, length varies. According to a recent New York Times article, it's now merely a trickle. The wide roaring river described in the historical record is no more. Now, as some of you know, I'm writing a book about indigenous trade networks between the Rio Grande Valley and the highlands of Mesoamerica, which I'm calling the Indian Camino Real. This long-standing native route crossed the Rio Grande, so part of my project seeks to reconstruct the ways this wondrous river shaped commerce. I'm also interested in the human habitation that emerged along the river, specifically at the ford near present-day El Paso and Ciudad Juarez on the Mexico side, where friars established Isleta Mission in 1680 and later the Presidio del Paso del Norte. And here's the location on Google Earth. And here is the location in a late 17th century map that is here at the JCB. First, apart from the cuteness of this map being called the bison map because a bison is holding open the cartouche, I think it's a fascinating reconstruction of the significance of the river, right? The landscape just seems to be crossed primarily by this wide-ranging waterway. I am trying to think about the ways I can employ cartographic sources, such as this one, for my historical reconstruction of the river and how it has changed through the course of time. Now, I was trained as a social and economic historian, so my immediate recourse is to run to the archive and look for words and numbers. This new project is forcing me, in a good way, to seek out other sources. My forays into environmental history has also been helped by my current immersion in the work of archaeologists and natural scientists who have studied this region. Now, as an example of the kind of work that I have incorporating into my own narrative is the work of archaeologists and cartographers who have, for example, found a marking in the Largo Canyon in New Mexico that matches constellations in the sky. And so this is called the Navajo Constellation of Largo Canyon. So at some point in the past, probably around 1500, Navajo peoples carved out parts of the canyon to match what they saw in the sky, which I think is, quite incredible. Now, today, I want to show you some of the documents and printed sources that I'm still tied to, the latter being part of what I did here at the JCB in the fall. So here are some of the sources that I did when I was working in the archive over the last couple of summers. I transcribed official correspondence. I looked at property records, both in Mexico and Spain. And here at the JCB, I looked at a lot of printed reports, such as by a friar, Alonso Benavides, and by John Bartlett, that we heard a little about yesterday, being related to the John Carter Brown Library. He was the commissioner of the boundary that divided the United States and Mexico after the Mexican War. So first, to begin with Alonso Benavides, he's particularly well known because his letter to the king was printed shortly after it arrived in Spain, and then it was translated in the 19th century into English. So a lot of people who have studied the Pueblo region have used Benavides to find out about the indigenous peoples who were living there at the moment of contact. Now, Benavides' report, I quote here in the Spanish, tells us some ethnographic information that is quite interesting about the Mansos Indians. And we learn from him that the Spaniards, on arrival, relied on the Manso people who had established settlements along the river for food, right? There is some mention here that the Mansos were calling in the Spaniards into their rancherias to ask for food. But the real point, right, the Spaniards had walked from Mexico City. They were hardly having a lot of food to share with the indigenous people. The Spaniards were the ones that asked to be fed by the Manso people. And so here he says that they very generously gave them fish and ratones, which I'm not sure what that would be in terms of the flora and fauna of the region. Ratones is mouse. To think about these sources, I'm also trying to figure out why it is that the Spaniards choose to establish key posts, presidios, along the river. And I'm trying to show that the Spaniards were, as in many parts of Spanish America, very strategic in identifying the places that were already points of commerce for indigenous peoples. They were, in almost all regions, Spaniards followed indigenous pathways. And so they also established missions and presidios at points where indigenous people had already identified as being important. So here is Benavides saying that it would be a wonderful idea to establish here at El Paso a small mission of 3 or 4 religious friars and some 15 and 20 soldiers, right? So that in that way they could secure the Camino every year, every time that the merchants from Mexico City tried to go up to Santa Fe. Another kind of record that I've used is a letter. A whole report was written after the Pueblo Rebellion, the Pueblo Revolt, also called, in which the people of Santa Fe, the ones who were driven out by Pueblo people, moved to El Paso, and from there they tried to reestablish a kind of colony. And they begged on a yearly basis for more resources from the viceroy in Mexico City. And so part of what they complain about at El Paso is how they struggle with the flooding plains of the Rio Grande. So by reading their descriptions of their attempts at having settled agriculture in the region and learning from the indigenous peoples who live there on how to control the waterways and establish channels, you get a sense of the Spaniards, even though they have just been driven away from the Pueblo region, are once again returning to El Paso and depending on people there to try to adjust to establishing a settlement in El Paso and trying to survive. I mean, there's a kind of famine that happens during these years. Now, the Spaniards, as we know, returned to Santa Fe and El Paso as a large settlement doesn't occur. But it's another instance in which, in the correspondence of colonists, you get a sense of the Spaniards learning from indigenous people about how to deal with the land that is affected by the flows of the Rio Grande, which at the time is over and over described as being a roaring river. Now, if we fast forward a couple of centuries to John Bartlett, he wrote a wonderful personal narrative of his journey. And he, as the head of the U.S. Boundary Commission, all of his papers are here at the JCB, by the way, and it's a treat to see the correspondence of this man as he's traveling across the continent, trying to map out the new territory that the U.S. has acquired from Mexico. He's wonderfully descriptive. So at mid-19th century, we learn that the status of the river was still hundreds of feet wide. Right? We have here his description of it being from 300 to 600 feet wide, and that there are places where there's not even a single bridge that can cross it. And now you think of the pictures that we see in the news reports about the Rio Grande where people can wade across. He also makes references to the irrigation canals that were built during the Spanish period using indigenous labor, right? And how there are references also of him understanding that in previous years, in 1851 and 1852, actually that's a typo, there had been a drought, and that in part the people at El Paso hadn't been able to have access to water because the acequias had stopped working. So these are some of the sources that I've used at the JCB. And part of the reason for why I wanted to bring this panel together is to make myself stop reading documents, which I think that's our secure point for us historians. Yesterday I was at a wonderful panel on contraband, and we were talking about how it is that you use maps to reconstruct the past. How do you identify trade networks in a map such as this one? And I think that one of the ways that I'm using maps, specifically in regards to the Rio Grande, is to look at the descriptions of it and how it's mapped out. Here is El Paso and the Rio Grande in much more measured quality than the previous map that I showed you. So by looking at a number of maps, I have about 20 maps over a course of 200 years. I'm getting a sense of how it is that people, the map makers, mostly in European map makers, are trying to figure out exactly where the river runs and where the important settlements are. In all of this, part of my goal for the book is to have the indigenous people that are always in the cartouche, to imagine what they would have seen in this landscape. So that's why I think the archaeological record and maybe other scientific sources can allow us to have a sense of how this river shaped so many different lives and how it is that it's gotten to the point where people at El Paso live in drought conditions. So that is what I wanted to say today. I wanted to just thank again all my fellow panelists for having such wonderful suggestions about how it is that we do environmental history. And I wondered if maybe a couple of people had questions, or if any of you wanted to have some additional comments. I know it's like when you're giving a lecture in university, right? The students never want to ask questions because it's such a large auditorium. So I always call on people, but I will not do that today. But I have a question. I've always wondered what it is about environmental history that has made it so that historians become excited about the possibility of turning to scientists and having conversations with the natural sciences. I've never really done environmental history. I've just kept up with the literature, and now I'm trying to do it a little bit for this project. But environmental history is such an invitation for us to be, to join with other disciplines, to think about the past. But I find that many of us, myself especially, as much as we want to talk about the environment and we want to identify aspects of nature that become our historical actors, we still rely on the words written by man. And I'm always trying to get people to talk about how it is that we can get at nature as a historical actor, how we can figure out how to talk about that from sources other than archival records and books and maps. And I think that there are some Mayanists, for example, who have done incredible work in trying to identify, the so-called origins of the collapse. And, of course, there was no collapse. But I think that kind of conversation of trying to use studies of like water analysis are another way of trying to understand the distant past where we don't have records from them.